I poured my water glass back into the pitcher, set my napkin on the table without unfolding it, and walked out of my daughter's dissertation celebration dinner while 28 people went quiet around me. That was 7 months ago. My wife called 21 times before midnight. I watched every call light up the screen and let every one of them go. I want to tell you something about the kind of man I thought I had been for 34 years. I was a structural engineer, bridges mostly, overpasses, retaining walls, the kind of infrastructure that people drive over twice a day and never think about. I worked for a firm in Indianapolis for 22 years and then consulted independently for another decade, and the thing that defined my career, the thing my colleagues would have said if you asked them, was that I did not guess. I calculated. I verified. I built things intended to hold weight that hadn't arrived yet. I retired at 61 with a clean record and a firm that still calls me twice a year when something complicated crosses their desk. I say this not to impress you. I say it because the way a man works tends to be the way he lives, and I lived like an engineer, methodically, with margin for error I hoped I'd never need. My wife and I met when I was 27 and she was 25, at a department barbecue in the July heat. She was there with a colleague, and I was there because my supervisor made attendance expected. We talked by the drinks table for 2 hours, and I drove her home and called her the next morning. We married 19 months later. We had a son, and then 4 years after that, we had our daughter, Georgia. For 34 years, I built a life the same way I built structures, patiently, with attention to what held things up. I was not a showy husband. I did not write poetry or arrange elaborate surprises. What I did was show up when the pipes froze the winter my wife's father was in hospice. I drove our son to every travel soccer tournament from the time he was 9 until he was 16:06 in the morning, often 3 hours each way. I sat through 17 parent-teacher conferences, not one missed. When my wife went through a period of anxiety in her mid-40s that neither of us could fully name, I made dinner every night for 8 months without comment and without complaint, because it was the only steady thing I knew how to offer. That is what I believed I was building. Something load-bearing, something that would hold. I was 62 years old when I first noticed the architecture shifting. She had always been social, my wife. That was one of the things I loved about her. She moved through rooms the way water moves, finding every shape, filling it easily. She had book clubs and garden clubs and a standing Tuesday lunch with 2 women she'd known since our children were small. That was normal. What changed was the Wednesday evenings. It started about 2 years before everything came apart. A pottery class downtown, she said. She'd been interested in ceramics for years, always meaning to try it. The class ran from 6 to 8:30, sometimes 9 if the instructor went long. She came home with clay under her fingernails and a kind of lightness I hadn't seen in a while, and I was glad for it. I did not ask many questions. I trusted her the way I trusted load calculations I'd checked 3 times, completely, and without feeling the need to check again. Then I noticed her phone. For years, her phone lived on the kitchen counter when she went to bed. That was simply where it went, the same place the keys went on the hook by the door. Reliable. In the spring of the year before George's celebration, I noticed it had migrated to the nightstand, then to the bathroom counter while she showered, then, on one occasion, into the closet when she took a call before dinner and pulled the door shut behind her. I noticed. I am trained to notice. But I said nothing, because I told myself that a 62-year-old man who had trusted his wife for 34 years did not start reading meaning into where a phone slept at night. Then I found the charge. It was March. I was reviewing our joint credit card statement. I did this every month, had done it for years, not out of suspicion, but because that was simply how I managed our finances, and I saw a line item for a hotel downtown. One night, mid-January, a Thursday. The amount was consistent with a standard room. I sat with it for a long time. I am a man who has looked at a set of load calculations and known, before anyone else in the room knew, that something did not add up. This did not add up. I went back through 2 more months of statements, nothing else obvious. But January was a Thursday, and the pottery class was on Wednesdays, and the hotel was 3 miles from the studio. I did not confront her. I have never been a man who acts before he knows what he's acting on. Instead, I did the thing I have done at every critical juncture of my professional life. I gathered information. The investigator I hired was a man in his mid-50s, quiet and methodical, the kind of professional whose card has only a phone number on it. He confirmed what I suspected within 4 weeks. My wife had been involved with a man from Phoenix for approximately 16 months. He drove up to Indianapolis roughly twice a month, sometimes on a Wednesday evening, sometimes on a Thursday, occasionally for a weekend when I was away on a consulting engagement. They met at a hotel near the University District, once at his sister's home in Carmel, twice at a restaurant I had taken my wife to for our 25th anniversary. I paid the investigator, thanked him, and drove home. I sat in the driveway for a long time. It was an early April evening, still cool, the neighbor's magnolia just beginning to open. The kitchen light was on. I could see the shape of my wife moving behind the window glass. I went inside, I kissed her on the forehead. I ate the dinner she had made. I said the things people say on a quiet Thursday evening. Then I called my attorney the next morning. Here is what I want you to understand about the months between that April and the night of George's dinner. I was not frozen. I was not pretending. I was doing what I have always done when a structure shows signs of failure. I was calculating the safest sequent corrections, not for her sake, for George's. My daughter had spent 6 years completing a PhD in environmental policy at a university in Chicago. She was 29 years old, and she had defended her dissertation in front of a committee the previous October, with the kind of precision that made me understand, not for the first time, that she had inherited the better version of whatever I had. Her celebration dinner had been planned for the following April, timed to coincide with the university's spring convocation. Both families were invited. Her advisor and 2 committee members would attend. Close friends from her program, 28 people in total. I was not going to detonate a 34-year marriage 6 months before my daughter's night. That was my decision, and I made it clearly, and I have no regret about it. What I did not expect was what happened at the dinner. The restaurant was a place Georgia had chosen herself, an Italian place near the university with a private dining room in the back. Long table, warm lighting, the kind of room that felt like something worth marking. I arrived 15 minutes early because I am always 15 minutes early. I found my place card near the left end of the table. Then I looked at the head of the table. There was a card there with a name I recognized. Not because I knew the man well, because the investigator had shown me his photograph 4 months earlier. He was already in the room when I had walked in, standing near the bar at the far end with my wife's brother and a man I assumed was from George's department. He had a glass of wine and was laughing at something. My wife was near the entrance, talking to George's advisor. When she caught my eye, her expression did not change. Not a flinch, not a flicker of acknowledgement. That was when I understood that this was not an accident. My place card had been moved, not to a seat of honor, not near the center of the celebration, to the far end, beside someone I didn't recognize, away from Georgia, away from where a father sat on his daughter's night. I stood beside that seat for a moment and said nothing. I watched him walk to the head of the table and sit down. He set his jacket over the back of the chair with the ease of a man who believed he belonged exactly where he was. I watched my wife cross the room and touch his shoulder once, briefly, as she passed behind him. Georgia came in from the hallway, still glowing from the afternoon. She found me immediately, crossed the room and put both arms around me and said, "Dad, you made it before anyone else." I said, "I always do." She laughed and went to greet the others. I stood at my seat. I looked at the man at the head of the table. I looked long enough that he eventually looked back at me. His expression shifted, something behind the eyes, some recalibration, and he looked away first. Then I looked at my wife. She was watching me from across the room, and her face had gone careful and still in a way that told me everything about what she had expected this moment to be. I picked up my napkin. I set it on the table without unfolding it. I pushed my chair back in. I buttoned my coat. Then I looked at my wife one final time and said, clearly and without raising my voice, "Enjoy the evening." I said it to her directly, so she understood exactly what I meant. Not to the room, not as a performance, to her. Then I walked the length of that dining room without looking at anyone else, pushed open the heavy door at the back, and walked through the restaurant and out onto the street. It was a cool April night. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and then I walked to my car, which was parked 2 blocks east, and I sat in it for 4 minutes. Then I drove home. She called 21 times before midnight. I sat at the kitchen table and watched my phone. I had made myself a cup of tea, the same Irish breakfast blend I'd been drinking since my 30s, and I sat with it in the kitchen I had lived in for 19 years, in the house I had chosen because the bones were good, and the lot was level, and it was the kind of place that could hold a life. The calls came in clusters, 4 together, then a pause, then 3 more, then a gap of 20 minutes, then the remaining several spaced further apart, the way a person's calls space out when they begin to understand that the conversation they planned is not going to happen on their terms. She came home around 11:30. I heard her key in the lock, heard the door open, heard her pause in the entryway. I did not get up. I sat with my tea. She came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long time. I looked back at her. She said, "We need to talk." I said, "Not tonight." She started to say something else, and I stood up, rinsed my cup, and said goodnight. I went upstairs. I read for an hour, and then I slept, which surprised me. But I think when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, setting it down, even partway, loosens something in the chest. The next morning, I made breakfast. I read the paper. I took my walk, the same 2-mile loop I had walked for 15 years, past the park and around the block with the old stone church and back down our street. She was gone by the time I returned. I did not know where she went, and I did not ask. Georgia called at 10. She was very quiet on the phone at first. Then she said, "Dad, what happened last night?" I said, "Georgia, your dinner was beautiful and your work was remarkable, and I need you to hear clearly that nothing about last night had anything to do with you or with how proud I am. Are you hearing that part?" She said, "I'm hearing it." I said, "Good. I need you to ask your mother some questions, and then I need you to make your own judgment about what she tells you. You're 29 years old and you are one of the sharpest people I know. Trust what you figure out." She was quiet for a moment, then softer. "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I'm clearer than I've been in about a year." She didn't say anything right away. Then I saw him at the head of the table. I didn't know who he was, but I saw the way she stopped. "I'll ask her." The convocation ceremony was the following afternoon. I had not missed a significant moment in my daughter's life in 29 years, and I was not going to start now. I wore my good suit, the charcoal one I'd bought for my retirement dinner, and I drove to the university and found a seat 3 rows from the front. My wife was there. She sat at the far end of the family section and did not look at me directly. Georgia's mother-in-law sat between us without appearing to plan it that way. When Georgia crossed the stage and the dean read her name, I stood up. I clapped the way a father claps when he has watched someone he loves do something genuinely hard. Georgia found me in the crowd, and her face did that thing it has done since she was 4 years old. A small, honest brightness that has never been for anyone's benefit but her own. Afterward, at the reception, I shook hands with her advisor and talked for a long while with her closest friend from the program, a young woman who had been to our house twice over the years for holiday dinners. I drank bad champagne and ate a piece of sheet cake, and I danced with Georgia to the song the department had playing over a small speaker in the corner, an old Fleetwood Mac song she had loved since high school, and I did not look at my wife more than twice. When I did, she was watching me with an expression I recognized from difficult meetings years ago. The expression of a person who has realized the conversation went somewhere they hadn't prepared for. The conversation with my wife happened 4 days later. She found me in the study. I was reading. I had been doing a great deal of reading in those weeks, the kind of long, slow books I'd set aside for years. She came in and sat across from me in the chair Georgia used to sit in as a teenager when she wanted to think through something serious. My wife has always moved into difficult conversations at full speed, as if velocity can substitute for direction. She started talking before I had fully set my book down. She said it wasn't what I thought. She said he was someone she had met through her sister, someone she had developed feelings for during a time when she felt invisible in our marriage, when she had tried to reach me and found that I was focused elsewhere, and she hadn't known how to make me understand how alone she felt. I let her talk. I have learned over a long career of technical review meetings and difficult client conversations that you let people finish before you respond. It is not patience exactly, it is economy. When she was done, I said, "I know about Phoenix. I know about the hotel in January. I know roughly when it started and how long it ran. I hired someone to confirm it because I needed to be certain before I said anything, and I needed to be certain before George's celebration." She went very still. "I've already been speaking with an attorney since April. The paperwork is ready. I'm not going to fight you, and I'm asking you not to fight me. We built something real together. I would prefer to end it without destroying what's left of it." She asked why I hadn't said something when I first found out. I told her what I'm telling you now. George's celebration was more important than my anger, and I needed time to understand what I was dealing with before I said a single word. There is a difference between reacting and deciding, and I spent a career learning to tell them apart. She cried. I had expected that. 34 years is not nothing, and I was not unmoved by it. I handed her the box of tissues from the corner of the desk, and I waited, because I have sat through difficult silences before, and I know that rushing them helps no one. After a while she said, "The dinner, seating him there. I don't entirely know why I did it." I said, "I think you do. But it doesn't matter anymore. The only thing it changed was my timetable." She asked if I had told Georgia. I said Georgia was capable of understanding what she had already seen with her own eyes. The divorce took 7 months. It was not uncomplicated, but it was civil. Our attorneys were professional. A mediator helped us divide 34 years of a shared life with more precision than I expected. I kept the house initially, then sold it 8 months after everything was finalized. It was too large for one person, and it had too many rooms I would walk past without entering. I bought a condominium on the north side of the city, 12 floors up, with a balcony that faces east and catches the morning light. I learned sometime in the months after everything settled that the man from Phoenix had not continued his involvement with my wife after that April. Georgia mentioned it once briefly, without seeming to think it required elaboration, and I didn't ask her to provide any. What my wife does with her life now is her own matter. Georgia calls every Sunday. She and her husband are expecting a child in October, my first grandchild, and she has already told me she wants me in the delivery waiting room. That is not where I would have placed myself, but I will be there because that is what you do when it matters. My son and I talk less often, but when we do, we talk longer. He asked me once, about 3 months after the divorce was final, whether I regretted the quiet, whether the months of saying nothing had cost me something I couldn't recover. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I thought about the April morning I sat with the credit card statement and understood what I was looking at, about the months of carrying it, about sitting in the car for 4 minutes after walking out of that dinner and then simply driving home. No, I said. The quiet was the only thing I fully controlled, and it turned out to be exactly enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I never really understood what your work was about until recently. You spent your whole career figuring out what things could hold. I have thought about that a great deal since he said it. I am 63 now. I wake up early and make coffee and stand on the balcony and watch the city come to light, which takes about 20 minutes from the first pale gray to full morning. I walk the canal path on days when the weather holds. I have been cooking properly for the first time in my adult life. Not reheating, but actually cooking, following recipes with the same attention I once gave to load specifications, and finding that the attention itself is satisfying regardless of how the dish turns out. I consulted on a bridge project last month, a pedestrian crossing over a reservoir outside of town. The engineering firm is young and competent, and they mostly want a second set of eyes, which I am glad to provide. I drove out to the site on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at the edge of the water and looked at the drawings and thought about load distribution and bearing capacity and the particular stubbornness of concrete under tension. And for an hour I did not think about anything else at all. There are things I would do differently. I was a man who showed up for the crises and was sometimes absent for the ordinary Tuesdays. That is true, and I sit with it honestly. Whether it explains what happened, whether loneliness inside a long marriage is ever an adequate reason for what my wife chose, is a question I have turned over many times and stopped expecting to fully resolve. What I know is that I cannot account only for her failures and not for my own patterns. But I also know what I saw at that table, a deliberate act, not a slip or a moment of poor judgment, a considered choice made at my daughter's celebration in front of people who mattered, by a woman who had already decided the story was finished and had written me out of it without my knowledge. I refused the role, quietly in my own time without making her the center of the scene she had arranged. A colleague asked me recently what I missed most. I thought about it honestly. I said, the assumption of company. Not any specific habit or evening, but the baseline assumption that when something happened, there was someone it was also happening to, alongside you. I am relearning how to be steady without that assumption. It is slower work than I expected, but I have always been comfortable with slow, patient work. That is, after all, how you build something meant to last. I kept the quiet when it was the only honest thing I had. I keep it still, not out of bitterness, not out of grief, out of something closer to respect, for the years that were real, for the man I tried to be, and for the particular kind of strength that does not announce itself until after it has already done what needed to be done.